So I'm tasked with talking to you about patient-centered outcomes research to try and provide some education around PCORI and a couple of other topics related to that. I'm also going to summarize the PCORI work that's been done already by DSF, and this actually will be continued tomorrow morning as well. And I don't have a disclosure slide on that, so that's good. We have had funding from PCORI. I think that's our disclosure. So PCORI is really what it says. It is patient-centered outcomes research, and it's an institute that is designed to do this. PCORI was appointed by Congress in 2010. It's a nonprofit organization, and it is meant to be independent from the government, although it turns out it has to have some of its funding reappropriated from the government every 10 years, so it's independent but not really independent. And really the goal is to help patients compare healthcare options, taking into account all of their preferences. Most research that is done regarding treatment options really is done in a very rigorous scientific manner. And as we've seen with Dravet trials already, there's inclusion and exclusion criteria, so you get just the perfect population. And it turns out that most patients haven't read the textbooks to figure out how to fit into those things, and there's lots of factors that could lead to being excluded from that. But those people need treatment also, and we need to try and figure out how to best treat them. Sometimes we also end up in situations where there may be two really good options out there, so Epidiolex is coming on the market, stiripentol is available in many centers, and hopefully fenfluramine will be on the market a year from now. And as a family, how are you supposed to know which one of those options to do? Nobody compared any of those options, so you don't really know which one is better. And so really that is the goal, is to help figure out some of those types of questions. The research focus is to develop some patient engagement in the research design and implementation. So right from the very beginning, if somebody is seeking PCORI funding, they need to be talking to patients to figure out what are your concerns and how do we make sure that's included in this research study. One of the other things that they very much focus on are comparative effectiveness research that compares two known treatments based on patient priorities. So what are the things that you're worried about, and can we compare two things that we already know are effective? And then they have some very specific methods and infrastructure that PCORI encourages people to use. DSF has had projects funded from PCORI. We were very fortunate to have a pipeline to proposal tier 1 contract. Apparently it wasn't a grant, it was a contract, which really was to help develop that patient engagement and to help us think as a group of both researchers, patients, all of the stakeholders involved in potential research, what our priorities are and how can we make sure that we're engaging the community. We then were able to move on to a pipeline to proposal tier 2 contract, not grant. I don't know why they specify that, but they do, which really we were supposed to focus and refine comparative effectiveness research ideas. And many of you may have participated in some of the activities that were around that. The idea had been that we would move on to tier 3 funding, which is where we would really spend a year to 18 months writing a grant and refining that comparative effectiveness research idea and potentially submit that to PCORI. But actually they ended that line of funding, and so we did not move on to a tier 3 proposal. In some ways that was probably okay because it actually allowed us to use our funding over this last year to figure out what our priorities really were, and perhaps they were outside of the comparative effectiveness realm. And then recently, DSF just heard that they received a Eugene Washington Engagement Award, and this is actually a 2-year award to really continue to focus on developing patient and stakeholder engagement. So patient-centered outcomes research. So this is research that helps you, patients and caregivers, communicate and make informed health decisions. So if you're given 2 particular medications that are approved for Dravet syndrome, which is best for your child at this point in time? What are the other factors that go into that? Or perhaps what types of behavioral therapies work best in Dravet syndrome? What are the optimal components of a good transition of care program? These are all patient-centered outcomes research. These are actually ideas that came from some of the work that we've done over the last 2 years. So the focus is to assess the benefits and harms of treatments so that you can have better informed decision-making, look at comparisons and outcomes that matter to patients. So when we're looking at an anticonvulsant, maybe it's not just the seizure count that's important. Maybe it's the effect on sleep and appetite and behavior. Maybe that is far more important than what the seizure counts look like. Is it inclusive? Are the outcomes inclusive of individual preferences and needs? And does it include a wide variety of settings and diversity of participants? I know one of the things that I have heard is that most of the research that's been happening for anticonvulsants is it only includes children from 2 to 18. Well, it turns out we see kids under the age of 2 with Dravet syndrome. And in my mind, that might be the best time to figure out what the best treatment is because we haven't started to see any developmental delay yet. And we also have children that are older than 18 who desperately need help managing their seizures. They've tried everything that's available out there. And so it's looking at those types of things to make sure that that's included in the research design. And then also optimizing those outcomes while addressing the burdens to patients. Filling out those seizure diaries every day, I know drives everybody crazy. And so maybe there's a better way to do that. Maybe we can think about that a little bit more to make it easier for you to participate in the study. PCORI wants to see research that's designed to answer the questions that you have because first of all, that really is the most important question, the question that you have when you come to clinic or when you're sitting at home thinking about these things. And that project is most likely to succeed because you're actually going to participate in it. If we start asking a question that you don't really care about, what's your incentive to participate in that? There probably isn't very much. So this really leads to successful research in the long run. So it's sort of the traditional way that research occurs is a question, a researcher, I might be sitting in my office on my own and come up with a question and then think, how can I measure that? And come up with an experiment and a measurement and then analyze that. And then I have to go around and figure out, how am I going to get everybody to participate in this question that I'm concerned about? And I don't really know if anybody else is. So the PCOR model really is to start with you and figure out, is this a project you're really interested in? Is there something more important that we should be focusing on? What is it that you're most interested in? How can we measure that? Is that measurement doable by families? Is that a reasonable thing to ask people to do? Are there current models out there that are looking at this already? Or have we tried to look at this and we're kind of missing something, that we're not getting it quite right? Then to move on to the experiment and measure and analyze the data. So it's getting you involved right from the very beginning. The other big focus of PCORI is looking at comparative effectiveness research. And I have to say from my perspective, this is the thing that was probably the most difficult for us to wrap our heads around because they really want direct comparison of things that already exist to determine which one of those things might work better. And I think we really have spent the last 2 days talking about the lack of data that we have in many of these comorbid areas, like behavior and nutrition and all of these things. And so I think this is somewhat tricky for our population because we haven't even really demonstrated that one thing works well, let alone finding 2 things that have already demonstrated efficacy to compare them. And so PCORI may not be the best mechanism for some of those questions, but it's something that maybe we need to keep thinking about and figure out how to wrap our head around that. So instead of asking what types of behavioral therapies work best in Dravet syndrome, really what we need to say is, does ABA or CBT work better in patients who are between ages 5 and 10 with Dravet syndrome? Which existing transition of care program works best in Dravet syndrome? So we need to be looking for things that are available out there already to go through this mechanism. And it turns out that looking at these 2 things, patient-centered outcomes and comparative effectiveness research, has a lot of overlap here in the middle. But there are some things that are patient-centered outcomes that aren't comparative, and there are some things that are comparisons but turns out they're not really patient-centered outcomes. And so we really need to find something that's in the middle to continue to look through this mechanism of funding for future sources of research funding. So we did develop some comparative effectiveness research ideas for Dravet syndrome, and this was discussed at many of the Day of Dravet meetings that happened around the country this last year, so many of you may have participated in some of these discussions. And you can see that many of these are the things that you guys are concerned about. Sleep. Sleep is a huge issue for everybody. And so one of the suggested ideas is which medicine is better for sleep, melatonin or clonidine? How can we improve the duration of sleep? That one's not really so much comparative effectiveness because there's nothing to compare there. But we could say, does melatonin or clonidine improve the duration of sleep? What's the best approach to improving nutrition? Is ABA therapy or medical management more effective for addressing behavior? What's the best way to manage status epilepticus? Is it Diastat or midazolam? Is it IV Keppra? Is it IV phosphenotoin? What's the best way to talk to families about the risk of SUDEP? I think this is something that we all need to hear about, need to talk about. I think for some providers, it's a very difficult thing to bring up, and for some families, it's very difficult to hear. And so what are the best ways to do that? And there definitely are models of how to communicate and facilitate communication between providers and families about sensitive topics. What's the best management for constipation? I'm sure we could probably list off 3 or 4 different medical or different ways of managing that and compare those. Does increasing L-DOPA help with gait? So should we be treating gait with Parkinsonian symptoms? So these are some of the ideas that came up during the project over the last 2 years. There are challenges in rare diseases. I think that for Dravet syndrome, many of these things have been overcome, but for many rare diseases, the patient groups are small. They can be somewhat disorganized. The community may not be prepared to do research. I know in my own practice, we spent a lot of time talking about why clinical trials had to be done and why somebody would have to go on a placebo arm so that we could get the answers, so that we could get a new medication approved. And so, it does sometimes take a lot of time to prepare everybody to step into research and understand why we have to go through this process. Oftentimes, patient concerns may not be prioritized. I think we've already talked a little bit about that. There may be few clinicians and researchers available to investigate. There probably need to be more of us thinking about research in Dravet syndrome. I was noticing today that, we kind of hear the same names over and over in the literature that's been presented over the last 2 days, and we probably need to expand that so that we have more people thinking about these issues. There have been few proven treatments, and that makes it really difficult to apply for comparative effectiveness research when you don't have something that's been proven to be effective to begin with. And then there's little funding, and sometimes, particularly when applying to a large organization, it can be really difficult to make the argument that spending this funding on a rare disease is going to help the larger population. And so that's something that we need to focus on as well as, could this be a representative example of what may help other rare diseases as well? And all of that can lead to a lack of patient-centered outcomes. If we don't have patients to talk to, it's hard to develop patient-centered outcomes. If we don't have researchers to do the research, we can't have patient-centered outcomes. And as much as we do like to volunteer our time, unfortunately, this work does take funding. My boss doesn't like it when I work for free too much. So we actually have made a lot of progress with this, and really what I should say is you guys have made a lot of progress with this. The Dravet, the DSF Family Network started in 2016 and has really been focused on organizing the patient community. There are over 2,000 registered families in this, and they've been engaged in 5 U.S. regions. These are the Day of Dravet talks that you go to. Caregiver concerns survey has been sent out so that we really have some quantitative data about what you're worried about. And that's really, really helpful when you're writing a grant. You have to demonstrate that it's a problem to begin with to encourage somebody to fund that research. Pipeline to proposal, we've talked a little bit about already, which has helped make a lot of this progress here. We really were able to pool a huge number of stakeholders together to talk about a lot of different areas: SUDEP, gait, behavior, nutrition and GI issues, seizure, status epilepticus, sleep. I think we already heard from Ann Berg this afternoon how much this informed her development of the natural history study. And then this led to the Tier 2 proposal, and we really tried to hone down a little bit more about what is the most important thing that we really need to spend our time on and look at, and continuing to work through that. What are our barriers to writing a comparative effectiveness grant, and how can we overcome those? And I think in the future, with the Eugene Washington Engagement Award, there are more steps that will happen based on some of the work that's happened over the last 3 days, and the work that will continue to happen with the Day of Dravet workshops and webinars as well. And all of this will help us move forward as a community to develop more research, and hopefully 2 years from now, when we present some of these same topics, we'll have more data to present and more answers to some of these questions. So I think we're going to move now to a panel of some of our participants in the PCORI project. So Michelle Wellborn participated as a parent. Linda, you're still here? Oh, so Linda's going to participate for a few minutes, but then she has to leave to catch a flight. Ann Berg, and then I'll step in for Linda as a provider on the panel. Our perspective for a few minutes of this process and what it was like. As somebody who has been relatively new to research over the last 5 years, most of my patient interactions have driven some of my research questions, which is a little bit backwards from other researchers. I think many other researchers just start doing research in medical school and kind of jump into it and try to figure out how to blend those two things together. But this was so eye-opening because we were able to go through and talk about individual topics and hear so much more than I was able to hear in an individual clinic visit. And it was really so eye-opening to hear what it is really like to live with Dravet syndrome and hear what people's concerns were. I mean, I see people for 30 minutes in the office, and usually you guys have a checklist of what you want to talk about. I have my checklist of what I need to talk about, and so we can't really delve into what does this behavior really look like, and how does that alter your family life. And so I found it incredibly eye-opening to hear some of these stories and have people talk about that.
Well, one of the discussions we had, and I think Lori Bailey now from Zogenix has followed through with this, is the impact that having a sibling with Dravet syndrome has on the quote-unquote unaffected children. And it was very clear that when one child in the family has Dravet syndrome, the entire family has Dravet syndrome. And we've heard from so many of these just extraordinary siblings already, and they're stronger. They've learned from this, and what I've heard is that they'd never want it to be otherwise. I mean, they have made this their lives, and they're amazing, but you still wonder what could have been. And it's there was a certain sense of loss there for them.
I think it's been nice being able to participate as a parent and not as a medical professional. And I think that the physicians actually got a chance to really kind of hear the heart of a family. And it was sometimes like a lot of tears, really, when we really started talking about things and trying to put questions around them for research. But it's been a really good experience, and I think this is the way research should be done.
Yeah, my research experience parallels Kelly's. I did not come out of medical school as a researcher whatsoever. I just started seeing a lot of children with Dravet syndrome, and it kind of built on that. So I think we, in a sense, have a similar approach to research as really coming out of it as physicians, as clinical doctors, kind of first and foremost, and are now delving into it more. And I agree that so these were monthly phone calls where you would get on the call and you hear the disembodied voices of Ann Berg and, you know, Kelly and other physicians and a whole handful of wonderful parents, as well as some, I don't know what you call them, business people? Industry, thank you. I was like blocking on that word. And in these phone calls, it was definitely primarily the parents, as it should be, talking, because it was what we wanted to hear from them and what their concerns are and what they would like to see done. And I also agree with Kelly that it was a complete, and Anne and Michelle, that it was just completely different to hear that on a phone call, as opposed to just a short time, that little blip in your life that I get to see you in clinic. So as a physician, I really liked the phone calls and the sitting and the listening. And now where we're at, I think, is a kind of a little bit behind us. So what is going to come out of this more so than just the phone calls?
Can I ask a quick question? What type of questions do you want them to ask you about about your research or what you found? Or I guess I'm confused of what you want them to ask.
Mary Ann?
Do I have my mic on? I do. I think kind of what your perspective is on this, and hearing a little bit about what happened behind the scenes. And I know you saw some of the topics we talked about. Is there anything that we missed? That was always an area of concern with us. We tried to make sure with the project participants that we had that we were representing all ages, both genders, but I think inevitably we worried that we may have missed something along the way.
My question is really just more general. I really love this idea. I love that all the physicians and the community is focusing on, what is important to the parents, which is what we think is important to our kids, right? So, and research has always been very important to me because I know that's the only way we're going to make progress. But I get frustrated because of the duration of time, right? The outcomes from research take too long, in my opinion. I get it, but it just feels too long. And so since these are very focused questions, do you think that there's a fast track to getting these types of answers as opposed to the more typical type of research that's being done?
Well, I think that part of this process and part of the idea behind this is that, as we prioritize these ideas, that because people have participated, that we'll be able to enroll people pretty quickly, and which moves things along faster. Sometimes to see a change, we do have to allow a certain amount of time. But really, the biggest thing that slows down any clinical research project is enrollment. And so, getting a sense of, having you involved from the very beginning so that everybody is ready to do this as soon as it's up and running, I think is one of the biggest things that will make things speed up quite a bit. I don't know, you're sort of addressing that with your natural history study. I don't know.
Well, a little bit. We're asking people what they're interested in. We're working a little bit more on trying to define the problems. I was just looking at the first question, which is better to improve sleep, melatonin or clonidine? And I guess the question is, what's wrong with sleep and what's an improvement? We don't know.
How do we measure that?
Right. What's a good, what's a meaningful improvement? And what if there's some downsides of one or the other? Is the downside going to wipe out any of the benefit? How much are you willing to put up with? Because ultimately, all of these therapies can have some negatives. It could be the cost. It could be the hassle getting it. It could be a whole host of things, or it could be side effects, or it could be the dose. Lots of things going on, and that all goes into comparative effectiveness. But without identifying those and measuring them, we're stuck. We could do a study and show that clonidine is more efficacious than melatonin, or vice versa. That is, in a very tightly controlled study it is, but what happens in the real world, and that's effectiveness. And we can't get at effectiveness without hearing from you what all of those pieces are.
Yes, I had a question. Most of these items I would think would have come up in your patient, in your normal visits that you would have with the doctor's office. And I'm sure you guys would hear on a repeated basis. Is this collection of data, is it more because it's a more centralized, sort of put together, single point of data point that you all can access from multiple locations? Is there just an issue with the whole compiling of data amongst all doctors across the nation that brings this about? Or, because I'm sure you guys have heard things in visits, and I'm sure it's been charted or put in a file, but is it the collection of data that's the issue? Because these items I would think would have been addressed on, time and time again.
I'm just going to say it's an excellent question that Amberg is perfect to answer. And I'm just going to apologize because I have to catch a plane. But thank you all.
So that's a really timely question. We have, as you know, medical records. We now have electronic health records. And we think that everything is now computerized in a nice, neat database, and we can go in and get it. What most people don't realize is that those electronic health records are really just a big, ginormous electronic bunch of papers that have been thrown on the floor. And there's no way of getting at the information unless you go in and actually read it. And we're at a point in this country where we're starting to talk about trying to standardize the input of information. And we're actually, some of us are involved in a project with Zach Grinspin out of Cornell trying to develop what's called a learning healthcare system. And that process involves going to a large number of pediatric centers and trying to get, epilepsy centers, and trying to get everyone to agree to document the same way. You've heard the expression herding cats? This is herding cats on steroids. Right, so there's a lot of interest in using natural language processing and related techniques, and we've looked at that a little bit, and it is, I have diminished enthusiasm every time I look at that. Everyone uses words a little bit differently. Sometimes someone does document something, sometimes there's just not enough time to do it. And then there are just people who they have their own way, and who knows? It's hard to match up what they do with what others do. But even under the best of circumstances, with people trying, just going through text can be really difficult. So it's a process that will take time, but it's being driven not just by researchers, it's being driven by physicians who want to be able to use their medical records for research purposes. We do have areas that are really good at doing that. The oncology world is really good, the cystic fibrosis world. There's some other consortia that have done this around the country and just said, we have to speak the same language. When you send me your medical records, I have to know exactly what's there and be able to combine them with mine. And they've come to agree as a large community of providers to do this. Epilepsy is a little bit back in the 1800s when it comes to that, still, unfortunately.
Hi. Okay, this is kind of a follow-up. Based on the, on your definition of the history, I was kind of thinking of the Alzheimer's chart. And my thought is this, and I was trying to get as you were scanning, in this questionnaire, in this national history, is it going to be inclusive, birth to the entire onset, or are you capping this at R18, which we're so used to?
Anyone can participate.
So this will be for all Dravet families and all levels of, okay, so that's incredible. That's really good news, because we kind of represent, I have a 28-year-old, and I think that that will be so interesting to see the correlation. And I mean, you will most definitely get a different perspective, but it might be very interesting to see how many things you think of, or these young parents think of, as their primary focus. And that may have waxed and waned, and by the time you have a 28-year-old, you might be right back there looking at some of those very same things again. So I think that outcome is going to be extremely interesting if we really do that cradle to grave concept, and I don't mean grave for our things, but if we can actually see both sides of this equation for the study.
Yes, absolutely, and the issues are different, as you're pointing out. They're different in a 6-month-old who's going to get diagnosed next week, probably after the first seizure, and in the 28-year-old who's been living with this for so long, and in the 12-year-old who's with raging hormones. There are different issues at different ages. At this point, we're probably not going to be greatly sensitive to things like endocrine issues and puberty, but throughout this questionnaire, and you'll see it, and it really is us asking you to help us do this better. We're asking, what should we be doing more?
This is just such amazing good news. Thank you so much.
Oh,
thank you so much for looking. I mean, I know it was done on the paper, but what a wonderful opportunity for us to look at the entire community, because I think that's what we've become. I think that's where our strength is. So, yeah, thank you.
I have a question. We have an amazing neurologist. He's probably seen, I'd say, 10 or 15 Dravet patients over the years. He's by no means a Dravet specialist like you all are. He's participated in trials for fenfluramine, Epidiolex. I mean, he's very engaged, but he's, like I said, not a specialist. What can we do to get him engaged in this process so that he is either participating with you guys as you're going through this, or at least aware of what's going on in terms of the results? Because obviously the more he is aware of these things, the better he can help us as parents.
I mean, that is definitely one of the things that came up in the call as well, and I think that it impacted how Anne is dealing with the data that she gets out of the natural history study, is making sure that it's available to people. We are working on writing a summary paper of our work so that it'll be available, and we will work to publish that as well as put it on the DSF website so it's available. We have been trying to put information on the website as well about the progress that was made throughout this project. And I would encourage your neurologist to reach out to any one of us. We're actually, any one of the physicians that you've seen speak, we're always happy to talk to people. We're always happy to kind of think about different treatment issues, and, just make sure that that your local neurologist has all the information that he needs to help out with that. That was also the impetus behind the consensus paper, is to make sure that this knowledge is out there for people. And we don't have comparative studies to answer these questions, but we know we have a handful of experts. We actually found quite a few experts. And there were a lot of areas where we were in agreement, and so we want to make sure that data is out there for people to use in their regular practice.
I would say too, is this a child neurologist or? Yes. Yeah, okay, the Child Neurology Society meeting, which is held annually, not always, but often has a superb CME symposium or breakfast seminar. There was one last year on Dravet syndrome. Dr. Knupp was one of the speakers. It was and Dr. Coe, there's Dr. Coe, and Elaine Worrell? Yeah, and Dr. Worrell. That was absolutely wonderful. And those get repeated on occasion. So you might keep your eye out for that, encourage your physician your neurologist to go to those. But those are fantastic ways to get the best update and to meet some of the top experts.
I just have a thought. What if we got the physicians involved in distributing the survey? For instance, when they go for their annual visit, or whenever the patients come in, instead of having the parents go online or have to go to the website. What about when getting the physicians involved in the distribution of the survey, or would that be even more of a headache?
It's a little tricky.
Do you mean on paper?
Well, either on paper or just when they go to their physician, they can tell them and maybe give them a card that says, go to this website. Or,
Right.
and then they could even follow up with their physician, because there's probably several questions that maybe they would talk about in their visit.
That's a really interesting thought. It's probably not a good idea to put it on paper, because it will be really long. And I don't mean to turn anyone off about that, but there are questions that you'll never see because they're not relevant. But if you print it out, they're all there. And then when you read through the thing, you have to figure out which is the relevant question. The computer makes it really nice. It takes you through quickly. We have considered, though, the flyer that you saw, of having a version of that could be made available in physicians' offices, and that will be a next step. But thank you, that's a great idea. Thank you.
I will say, just in fair disclosure, that can be really tricky at some institutions, because for research to happen at my institution, it has to be IRB approved at my institution. And so sometimes handing out a flyer is enough, but I know Linda and I did something that was research I was doing, but for her to hand out flyers, she had to go through her IRB. So we'll have to figure that out. Yeah. But I think it's a great idea. It's just, there is red tape.
Yeah. So that's an excellent point, and it depends on the individual's involvement. Yeah. So, for example, if Dr. Knupp were to give out the flyer for the study, and she's part of the study, she would have to go to her IRB and get permission. I don't think it would be hard, though. It went really quickly through ours. But if another physician, say you're a neurologist, you want to get that person involved, say, hey, why don't you, that might be a nice way to get him engaged. If he's in private practice, I think he can do pretty much what he wants. And if he's at an institution, he might have to get approval of the institution to hand out the flyer, but if he's not directly involved in the research, I don't think it would be as large an issue.
But we can sort that out.
Yeah, we'll figure that out. And everything that we do hand out is approved by the IRB, and it will say so on anything. So we are above board. It's all done according to the rules, and we can provide all of that documentation.
Hi, as an international parent, I would just want to share with you that I feel really lucky and blessed to be here. It has been a great experience, and I really thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks. We're glad you made it.
I also would like to thank you. We have a 37-year-old, so we've had a lot of years of going it alone, and now we were just talking earlier, a lot of the questions are going to be, they've kind of passed Danny by. He's getting into the stages where he's not as responsive. He used to love to play the piano and sing "Oh Danny Boy" at the top of his lungs, and so it'll be part of our filling out of we'll get that, but it won't be as much specific things that he's doing now. But we
information on prior stages. He's been through a lot of different stages over the years.
Yeah, we can give you the overall picture. And I just had a thought, too, about we're here hearing about this survey, so hopefully we'll all participate. I wonder if you want to send out even a postcard or a follow-up. People that are in marketing say you have to hit people a couple, 3 times before they answer. And that'll make people, all the people that attended here, aware of this survey. There are probably a lot of people that were here this weekend but don't really know that we want them to participate. So maybe a little follow-up with the group that came this weekend.
We will do that. We're working really closely with Marianne Meskis and Nicole Villas, who are 2 of the most incredible superwomen I've ever met, and we'll work together and make sure that happens, for sure.
I just wanted to say thank you again.
Yeah,
we appreciate all the work you guys have done. It's been a real great experience.
So, when it comes to different seizures evolving at different times and development, one of the questions I have is whether there are certain times in your life metabolically where different medications are more efficacious than others. So if you tried Keppra when you were an infant, is its metabolism or effect on your body different after you've gone through puberty? Those are other questions I've thought about.
I think that's definitely something that we'll be collecting in the natural history database as well. I mean, I think in my patient population, I see that, which is a little bit different than what Dr. Senato presented, but I see keto diet as more effective at a younger age and isn't quite as effective at older ages. And so we'll be collecting that data in the natural history database. I mean, we do know that different ages do metabolize medications differently, and Michelle can probably answer that even better than I can. But for instance, the dose of Topamax that we put an infant on is the same dose that we would put their parent on because they metabolize it differently. But even more specifically for Dravet syndrome, because of the sodium channel changing over time in how much it's expressed, is one medication better at a different age than another? I don't know that we know that.
Yeah, that's that was my line of thinking. My history with this has been 13 years, nowhere near 37, but there are a lot of phases, and each time something different would happen, I couldn't help but think, what's going on with the sodium channel? And what medications can now help that maybe didn't help? And that's why I really strongly recommend going back to things that might not have helped before, because it might help in the future. The other thing is the seizure types change, and as the seizure types change, the medication add-on or take-away is going to be different as well. So.
I was just looking for a little bit of clarification of this process, and I know that you'll be like gathering the information and organizing it, prioritizing it, and then there'll be studies. What will that look like? Do you have an idea of, will there be numerous studies at one time? Do you have a goal of how many in the beginning? Or I'm just curious if you guys have an idea of what.
That's a really interesting question, and in all honesty, I'm very open-minded. When I said that this would be designed by you, I really meant it. And I can guide it. Methodology, no problem. And we have tons of expertise in here. But what we really need to hear is, what does the Dravet community, the Dravet syndrome community, want to know? And that gets back to these comparative effectiveness questions. If you want to focus on sleep, then we really should be designing exquisitely detailed and sensitive measures, not ones that take you 5 hours to fill out, mind you, but ones that are really well designed, that really capture the difficulties with sleep, falling asleep, staying asleep, the extra movement during sleep, the autonomic features during sleep, the seizures during sleep. We have to capture all of that in a way that you can record, because we also don't want you staying up all night measuring things, and then design the study using those measures. But it really is going to be up to you. And I don't see this as being a one-shot something that we do, but I see this ultimately, my vision is that we'll develop a platform that pretty much any group could use. There are now probably 30 groups out there now, but there are probably going to be hundreds of rare epilepsy groups that are going to have the same kinds of questions. So their issues the domains will be the same, the sleep, the mobility, the specifics within each may be similar or very different. But my goal is that any of these groups, any of you parents who have a child with these difficulties, should be able to find a way to do the studies that will help you find answers. So it's a big goal. We're starting with Dravet syndrome because we all have a very close connection already, and you're already so advanced in this area. And you said, yeah, let's do it. So, but there are other groups that we're working with too, and I'd love to see everyone come together because, as I said, you're all sharing the same problems.
I have a question for Marianne and Nicole. What are the goals of the Eugene Washington Awards? So you have funding for the next 2 years, and what are your goals with that?
So Real quick, I wanted to say, because I think there might be a little bit of confusion, that Anne's project is very complementary to what we were doing in PCORI, and we realized when these questions were developed that what we really needed was Anne's project to help us get to that next phase.
PCORI explicitly does not fund natural history studies.
Right,
It says it like 12 million times on the website.
So, and we have some ideas and next steps coming off of this pipeline to proposal project. But when we had worked on the new grant, the idea was we wanted to make sure that the entire community understood what this process was, because quite honestly, the project partnership of 16, I think, really struggled with that in the early days, trying to understand what the comparative research questions could and couldn't be and what was available for us to do now. And as we got to the end of it, we realized that we don't really have in our community a lot of treatment options that we know of that, you know, for instance, the melatonin or clonidine we might be able to compare, but we don't know what two options are for nutrition. And so those are the things we really need to better understand, and that's where Anne's project comes in so well. So going forward, there are multifacets to this new grant, including we had a researcher meeting to make sure that they understood that seizures alone are not what we're concerned about. And then a lot of the other facets are different educational things, such as these sessions, such as Day of Dravet sessions.
Yeah, and I would just add that we have two big overarching goals with that Eugene Washington grant, which is a PCORI grant. One of them is to get the patient community ready for the research when it comes out. So it's conversations like this, getting you guys to buy into why we need a natural history study, why we need to know this information from you, and making you guys willing to participate and give that information, because it's probably going to come in a series of things that are going to be extra things for you guys to do. So making sure that the community understands the importance, that they believe in it, that they help design it, because if you guys are doing something that you didn't help design, you're probably going to have bad feelings about it, and it's not going to measure the right things. So it's getting the community ready for it, getting them engaged in the process. And then the other big hole that we saw with that pipeline to proposal project was that the researchers were not exactly understanding patient-centered outcomes research. So they were often interested in whatever tracks they were going down for knowledge or for cure of a disease, but not necessarily for the burden that we're having as we manage the disease throughout the life state. So the two big goals are patients and researchers. And so we're trying to get everybody kind of on the same page and listening to each other.
Okay, so one of the statements I had, which was a little bit on others, please make sure that you send out the emails asking us to do the surveys multiple times. Okay. multiple times. I'm very bad at this myself because we get so inundated with everything else. Many of us are working parents. Many of us are single parents. So sitting down and having time is difficult. So having a survey that you said we can come back to, hopefully within a week and finish, is great, because I don't usually have 2 hours of time where I can sit down and do it. But I'll check my email frequently, and I won't delete it because I'll mean to go back to it. But then it gets off the screen because it's buried in 10 other emails and I didn't see it. And so unless I'm actually going back and scrolling, I won't go, oh yeah, I forgot to go do that, but I saved that email so that I would. So make sure that you, gentle reminders, asking us to do it again. The suggestion about having the doctors convey that information about doing the survey to the patients and their parents, their caregivers. I know that Dr. Miller, in one of our discharge papers, had said, register for REN. And it was part of our discharge stuff. So I know that maybe not everybody could put it in their stuff, but it's not just like, oh, here's a diagnosis or here's a prescription. Some of it's like, go check out this book to read, it might help you. Or register for Boggy Creek, for the epilepsy camps. So I know that the doctors can, many times, suggest those resources or those things for the parents to actually do to help the group as a whole. One of the things I'd like to also see, because it's such a spectrum. My son is high functioning compared to some of the others. So it's hard to tell what track am I going to be on and what am I going to see. But one of the best things about DSF that I've seen is that it connected the parents, that there was somebody else who was going through what we were going through. So having that outreach, having that connectedness, and for me it started on Facebook, was important. But I think not just like where might the children's and their behaviors and their approaches, but maybe also focus a little bit on caregivers. You know, you say you can't, you have to take care of yourself too. I know for myself personally, went through, I would consider it almost like stages of grief, where you get that acceptance and then you have that moment of, well, we'll make it the best of it. And so then now I go out and we do a lot of things that I wouldn't have allowed ourselves to do earlier. So I don't know if you could incorporate some things for caregivers, not just the kids with Dravet, those resources. And then as far as the website, the educational stuff is great. I've directed teachers and the people to the website, because when you go and you say Dravet syndrome, they've never heard of it. And sometimes I think that they feel that we might be blowing it out of proportion, at least for me, because my son was mild, that they don't get it until they actually saw it. But it could be a year before they might see it. So having them see the videos and having that website, but maybe if there was another tab for other medical professionals, that there's a tab for doctors, like they have a patient who might be newly diagnosed, maybe they would have a special tab to resources for medical personnel, not just resources for education. That's what I would like to kind of see added.
I think we all appreciate that feedback, and honestly, where the foundation is at is because of everybody putting those ideas out there. So I would love it if you would email those to me, just so I don't forget afterwards, and we'll put them on the list. And
So my question, I think this is a great idea to kind of get, research questions going and I target what we're actually interested in. I really like that. I guess my question is also sort of the other side of that. Is this also going to be used on some level as like a bank on some level to like characterize perhaps what each of our individual children have experienced, so that if, say, a research study does come out targeting sleep, that you can sort of go to those families who are particularly struggling with sleep at that one time, or there's a new gene therapy that specifically targets whatever, like a new nonsense type mutation, because I guess one of my biggest fears with all this, and one of the struggles, which I think I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, is just like the fear of like missing something, like, oh, I should have known about that sooner, and I wish my doctor had known about that, or I feel a lot of responsibility for that. And is there a way to use some of this pooled data so that you sort of know where each of us are in time on some level to like reach back out to us, I guess?
So you're asking if we can refer you to another
No, if
we have a research study that's starting, can we go into the natural history database to figure out who might be eligible?
Yeah,
for
like
that
could the
and
researcher
contact
reach out
those
to you
people?
and say, oh, I'm wanting to do this study, do you have a pool of parents who, kind of would be interested?
If you have contact data, it's just an issue of changing your consent form.
Right. I think our consent form does have the does allow for it allows you to tell us that we can recontact you.
Okay.
So yes, we could do that. But the other thing that might be interesting to do, I don't want to put too many things on Marianne's list, but I wonder if there's some way, or maybe you're already doing this, of keeping track of trials and keeping a list on the DSF.
That is on
you
the
do.
website.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's been my resource of sort of knowing what's going on. But that's, like I said, I'm just afraid I'll miss something. And if someone's coming up with something new and they're...
Right. We eventually, we're just starting. This is new. So please do excuse the burbles and the bumps. But we will eventually have add to this to our website. So there's an informational website that will contain information about new trials, what the results are. And we can have some ways for parents to come in and link what they've already responded to other information on the website. We really want to build this. So if you have ideas as we go along, we'd love them. This is a partnership.
Yeah. And I think from a researcher standpoint, I think most people who are doing research in this space would recognize that reaching out to DSF is probably the best way to recruit patients. So I would hope that researchers would recognize that. I can't think of anybody doing research in this space that doesn't know that yet. But
I have a question here, but first I wanted to ask something too. Are you going to have any open-ended questions? For example, what questions are we not asking, or what questions should we ask in the future? or
Yes.
have it open, and then, like, what can you tell us about sleep issues that you haven't answered? That maybe not everyone has to answer, but if they answer the questions before, they have the option?
Yes, each section has an area where we ask, is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about this? Or it may be worded a little bit differently to be appropriate, but it's basically, is there anything else you'd like to tell us about this? And would you like to suggest some questions that we should ask in the future?
I don't actually have a question, just a quick plug. I actually did the natural history survey already in between courses, and it's easy. So do it and be done with it.
I had a suggestion. If the time-consuming portion of it or aspect of it is too much for most of the families, if it's something that's brought upon, randomly or later down the road, maybe limiting the amount of questions that's on the questionnaire. So it's not a 2-hour process, it may be a 20-minute process,
Sure.
and just do more of them.
Right. So this first one covers everything that we've looked at. It doesn't cover everything you might want to know about, but it covers all the areas that we've been able to cover so far. But the idea would be in the future when we start doing more dedicated studies that we design that with you with exactly those sorts of issues in mind. Because I'm not going to give people a 2-hour questionnaire every 3 months. Forget about it. Nobody in his or her right mind would do it, and I wouldn't want you to. This is a one-shot thing, and we'd really like to get as many of you as possible to take. I know it's asking you for your time, but you can do it over a period of time, and really kick those tires and tell us what worked, what didn't work, and how we can do it better. So I'm not exactly asking you to participate in the study. I'm asking you to study the plans for a study and help me with it, help all of us with it.
Just out of curiosity, really quick, I wasn't here for part of the presentation, so did you explain that we would love it if an eventual version of this was robust enough to qualify as an FDA baseline to measure future treatments again?
Yes.
So there's a reason that there has to be a lot of questions.
Right, yeah. We do hope eventually to develop those questionnaires, those parent-reported instruments that could be used to study meaningful outcomes in a randomized trial for the FDA, that the FDA would accept. And to do that, they have to be sensitive. There has to be the spread. Again, remember I showed you that normal curve of what an intelligence score looks like, and your kids are all the way down at the end, and there's no spread. We need to be able to measure within the range where your children fall, and then be able to tell when they're doing better or worse. So that's what we're aiming for, in part, and again, to fulfill the FDA mandate.
I think this is more of a question actually for the Dravet Syndrome Foundation, but is there a centralized registry where by state we can figure out what our resources are? So in what states can you get in-home nursing for what conditions? And in what states can you get a Medicaid waiver where you can actually get Social Security disability under the age of 18 despite income? And what areas in what states is styropental covered by Medicaid so that we can figure out where to move?
So, no, there is not currently, but what we do have are ambassadors in each region. And so part of this family network that we've been developing over the past year and a half is to address those exact questions, because the experts on getting the resources, getting the nursing, getting something covered under your state's Medicaid program, or even getting Medicaid in the first place, the experts on that are the parents that have gone through it. So my best recommendation is to contact your ambassador for your region, and they can put you in touch with someone knowledgeable in your state. We have tried, or people in the past have tried to maintain sites like that with state-specific listings, and what happens is they become out of date as soon as the legislation changes in a state or a provider goes out of practice. So for a small nonprofit, we just can't keep up with it. So ask your ambassador.
Yeah. So, can I? Yeah. There was a talk yesterday about transition, pediatric. Yeah. Yes, it was yesterday. What was her name?
Janine Sullivan spoke, and there was something in her resources at the end that went by state, but I think that was adult care programs or
Right, it was transition to adult care programs, but some of what you were asking about is related to that, to get resources, and I don't know that the resources were specific to adult transition, but there was some site that had information that went by state, and I don't know if it's exactly the right one, but her name was Janine.
It was Janine Sullivan. It was the talk on transitions.
Right, and she spoke yesterday at 4:45, and her slides are in the app. So take a look at that and see if that helps.
Yeah.
One last question.
Okay.
This one's a quick one. I just wanted to throw out, being in medical, you probably already know about HIPAA, and I wondered if you needed some kind of thing at the end of the form just to protect yourselves from any liability because of all this medical information, or is it not specific enough to the patients? Okay, I just wanted to throw the HIPAA thing out there.
This is really cool. This totally blew me away. This doesn't come under HIPAA because because the parents are voluntarily providing the information to us. It is not a transmission of the information. It could be the exact same information. In fact, we do invite you, if you would like, to upload your seizure plans and genetic testing reports, if you want to. You don't have to, but if you'd like to. If those were to come from Dr. Knupp's office, we would need the HIPAA hooray protections. If you decide to give them to us, HIPAA does not apply. So we don't have to waive. Nope. No. There is a consent process, and it tells you what we'll do, what you'll do, et cetera. But no, we do not have to worry about HIPAA. I know, I was completely blown away when Emily Goldbeck told me. I did handsprings. I then had to go see my chiropractor, but I was very happy.
Okay, I don't want to make this more complicated. I don't like to fill out a 2-hour survey, but I love the questions and I love more information, and so to me it's totally worth my time because I think it's great. You have to have that information. So with that being said, I have a son who has the SCN1A gene mutation. He has a frame shift, and yet he is so atypical Dravet. And we are constantly running into roadblocks where he should be following the Dravet pattern, and he isn't, and doctors are going, what do we do? What do we do with this child? None of the the first-line meds, the second-line meds, all of those things that are the typical Dravet cocktail don't work for my son. They actually make him worse. So right now he's on Banzel, which is an absolute no-no, and it is one of the only things giving us success. So, and diazepam doesn't work for my son, and we tried to get in on the fenfluramine study, and because he is so unstable, we weren't allowed to be in this study. So we're constantly running into these roadblocks, and even with the different information, we've received a lot of incredible information here, but so much of it, he doesn't fall into these categories. So I'm really interested to know, are there other kids that are this atypical with Dravet syndrome, and what path do we go down when our child is this severe Dravet, but we aren't finding the things that should be successful?
And I think that's the whole point of collecting this
Yes,
is, all of us have a handful of patients that are not following the textbook the way that we should, and we don't know why. And it's hard for both you and for us to know what to do next because they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And we need to figure that out and see if we can figure out who those kids are and how to better manage that population.
Yes. So I'm grateful you're doing this, and I'm grateful for all these questions. We'll answer anything you want to ask. So thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to say, I don't know how many of you heard Dennis Lawl's talk yesterday. He's a geneticist at Cleveland Clinic, and he has a big vision for all this wonderful information from the medical record, from research, from all these different sources, including genetics, coming together into a single database. And we talked a little bit about the problems with the medical records, but a research database does not have those issues or should not have those issues. And part of what we're asking, if you're willing to share it, is information about the genetic mutation. And this is the kind of data, because we're collecting it systematically, could then be used by someone like Dennis Lawls to correlate the exact mutations and say, okay, these are all the children who are very atypical for Dravet syndrome for whatever reason. And oh my gosh, look at this. He could do that. I personally couldn't, but these are the kinds of data that could then go on to a researcher who could do that. Pardon? LALS, L-A-L-S. With an S? No S.
There's no S, it's just Dennis Lau. So I want to thank you guys for participating. This is hugely important. These conversations are amazing. They're great for the doctors to hear. They're great for us to hear because we need to know what matters to you guys, not what matters to us. So we'd like to continue these conversations tomorrow morning in the PCORI session. Today on your way out, sign on the sign-in sheet and you'll get your $15 gift card. Tomorrow for the 2 hours, you'll get your $35 gift card. And as we kind of end the more professional part of our conference, I just want to say a thank you to all of the doctors and all of the researchers and all of the parents who took their time to be here for this, because this is none of our jobs. This isn't the doctor's job. Their job is to see patients and to do research. This is not their job. They just do this because they care. This isn't my job. I just do this because I care. This isn't any of your jobs. You all arrange childcare. You arrange for family members to watch your kids, and we know how hard it is. So thank you for taking your time. And one person in particular has really gone above and beyond for this conference. So Dr. Knupp has put in hours and hours of work, and so we just asked several of your patients to share their stories with you. And so that's a book from your patients to you, facilitated through us.